Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Affirming Practice Podcast. Today's episode, we are discussing intersectionality and how it is a key thing in allyship. It's both how the different parts of ourselves come together and how systems of oppression interact against individuals based on who they are. Somehow the term is both incredibly simple and exponentially complicated, but it does matter.
My name is Bob Irian. I use he, him pronouns. I am a Lutheran pastor in Pennsylvania, and I am committed to being a good ally to the best of my ability and grateful for people who teach me how to do that.
I'm Dr. Casey Ann Brimmer. I use they, them pronouns. And together we are the hosts of the Affirming Practice Podcast, a podcast where we discuss issues of identity, allyship, and more so that you have access to the information in an accessible way.
Or as I like to call it, yummy queer affirming goodness.
Yummy queer affirming goodness. Uh, we start each episode with introductions because it is a way for each episode to be a standalone episode. You don't have to have listened to everything in order to listen to this. So welcome. We are glad you are here. When we discussed this the other day, you talked about the MLK quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Do you want to explain what that means and how you see it connected to intersectionality?
Sure. That's sort of my entry point to the concept of intersectionality. Because it gets at the idea that um, it's not enough to worry about justice for myself or for people who are like me. I need to be concerned about, are all of my neighbors able to experience justice and equality and uh, full human flourishing, basically. And if my LGBTQ neighbor is not experiencing those things, for me as a cishet person, that should still matter. If my neighbor who is a person of color is not experiencing those things, for me as a white person, that still matters because one, I care about them as a human being. And two, even if I don't care about them as a human being, which I should, but if I don't, even so, any entity that can take away their justice and dignity and rights and flourishing can also take away mine. And the fact that I happen to have been fortunate enough to be born into a number of privileged classes at this moment in time, in this place, in this country, doesn't mean that I would have that same privilege everywhere or that that privilege is permanent. And so justice is the safeguard for all of us.
It is. So I'm not sure if my introduction to intersectionality was that Martin Luther King quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," or if it was the Martin Niemoller poem, "First They Came." So I'm going to read that poem briefly.
Please
It
do.
says, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there is no one left to speak for me." So I think that may have been my introduction to the topic of intersectionality and why it matters that other people, if other people are being oppressed, like exactly like you just said, the same organizations that can take away others' rights can take away mine, or grant others' rights can grant mine. And so intersectional and coalitional are so two groups who completely, quote, different, working together to advocate for rights. Those things are really important in allyship, and it's part of why you are here. You are here because you care about someone who is different from you, and you care about them and want to help them in the same way that they likely want to be able to support you or would want to support you if your rights were being jeopardized. Um, so I'm an academic by trade. I like citations. And it's not so much that I like them, it's that other people say things in very beautiful ways, and I want to give them credit for it. So I do not have direct quotes, but I have the citations. And what I want to start with is that intersectionality, the term itself, was coined in 1989 by Kimberle Crenshaw. It is not a new term. It is long standing. And before Crenshaw named it, Black feminists and feminists of color were doing intersectional work. Um, and so Crenshaw named it based off of systems of oppression and that intersecting point where, say, racism and sexism overlap, come together, and harm people. So it's, she used the example of a Black woman not getting a job, not just because she was Black, but because she was a woman. And that intersection of being a Black woman, because the place hired women and they hired Black people, but they didn't necessarily have a lot of Black women employed there. And so Crenshaw coined this term, and it's been used in a variety of ways since then. And some of it looks at that intersection of systems, and some of it looks at how all the different parts of you come together and make you you. You are a cake. um, and what I mean by that is if each part of your identity, your race, your class, your ethnic, or your religion, your gender, your sexual orientation, your romantic orientation, if each one of those was an ingredient in a cake, when you mix them all up, even before you bake them, you can no longer separate out the parts.
I will just plug my own moment of Lutheran pride. Martin Niemoller, for those who don't know, was a Lutheran pastor and theologian in Germany. During the late 1930s, he became an opponent of the Nazi regime and paid a hell of a price for that. Interestingly, what a lot of people don't know, and it's sort of the basis of the poem that Casey Ann just read, is initially he appreciated what the Nazis were doing. He thought they were making Germany great again, for lack of a better way to put it. And but over time, he came to see how dark and destructive that ideology was, and he became an opponent. And eventually, like I said, he was imprisoned and tortured and beaten and all kinds of other things for it. So,
Did not know that.
mm-hmm.
Do you want to respond to what I was saying about any of that? The Crenshaw, the you are a cake.
Yeah, I would just what I was thinking about with the example that Crenshaw started with of, a place that hires Black men and hires women, white women, but doesn't hire Black women. Um, to me, part of the thing about intersectionality is that sometimes it is the intersection of different parts of our identity that can either grant us privilege or that can open us to discrimination and injustice. That, right, a business owner may have one set of perceptions about white women and one set of perceptions about Black men that are fairly positive in both cases, but a negative set of perceptions about Black women just because of the way those identities intersect. And that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind, because oftentimes people will say, as we talked about in an earlier episode, well, I don't see fill in the blank. I don't see color. I don't see gender. I don't see whatever. And the reality is, we do, whether we want to admit it or not, we do see those things, and they can impact our assessment of someone's identity in very subtle ways that we're not even aware of.
Definitely. Definitely. Um, I think of the intersection a lot when I'm speaking with you about, for me, being queer and previously like and faith, that intersection has always been incredibly important to me because of my history and existence, and having tried desperately to pray away the gay because I was told you can't be gay and Christian and all sorts of things. And it's an intersection I find absolutely fascinating. I almost did a whole dissertation on trans faith leaders, and one day I'll return to the research. But that's one of the intersections that I can explain to people, right? It's something that people understand on an intimate level in some ways, is how their identity and their faith or lack thereof come together. Um, so for me, I fought that battle of can you be queer and Christian? And I fully believe you can be. I'm just not. But when I was in the church, being queer and in the church, or being someone assigned female at birth and in the church, that particular church that I was at, those were complicated intersections, sexism and misogyny blended with faith, and rather blended with religion as a systemic thing. And a lot of people can look at that particular intersection and somehow understand it differently than they would say your how your gender and your sexuality interact. Um, and I think there's a point of I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. For me, that is one of the best examples of intersectionality that I live. Because when I walk into a faith-based space, a church, for example, I am very, very aware of my gender presentation. I am very, very aware of my sexual orientation and romantic orientation and all the things that I've been taught through, quote, religious doctrine that was wildly misinterpreted. Um, and it's something like you'd be aware of this. Your wife is a pastor. The number of people who believe that women should not be pastors. Didn't the Baptists just vote something on that? Okay. Okay, an hour ago. Southern Baptists to advance a formal ban essentially on women pastors.
Right.
Um, actually, one of the texts that you and I have talked about is Pastrix. What is it? The Cranky Beautiful Life of a Sinner and Saint by Nadia Bolz-Weber.
Mhm.
Like, may or may not be part of why I was willing to talk to you as a Lutheran pastor.
I need to send her a thank you note.
If you know her and you have not told me, I'm going to be very upset with you.
I cannot claim to know her. I have met her. I can't say I
I have
know her.
to, but I was incoherent with a migraine, so I don't actually remember much of it.
Yes.
Can you, because we use examples so much in this, can you think of an intersection of your own identities that, like, just how they interact, not even systems of oppression, the you are a cake idea of intersectionality that, like, you would want to speak to?
Um, yeah, I mean, the first thing that leaps to mind is, in addition to, all of my other identities that we've talked about before, I also happen to be a veteran. And a lot of people, when they find out that I'm a veteran, they assume that when I was in the military, I was a chaplain, and I was not. That was actually before I went to seminary. I was I was a surface line officer in the U.S. Navy, which means I was a general run-of-the-mill ship driver. But I remember in a meet and greet with a congregation prior to a call interview once, a person of a very sort of progressive political stance really kind of wanting to pin me down and ask some really hard questions about how one could be a pastor and in the military. Like how to make those how do those two identities intersect? And I mean, my identity as a veteran is not as, I guess, to the front, so to speak, for me. But that was a case where I had not seen any kind of a conflict between those identities up to that moment, and still don't. But it made me sort of think through it theologically and anthropologically to be able to, why don't I see a conflict between those when some people clearly could see that those
Yeah.
would be in conflict. Um, you know, and I'm very aware that as a male pastor, particularly as a white male pastor in my denomination, which happens to be the whitest denomination in America, unfortunately, um, I am perceived differently, and I am just uh, I am both perceived and received differently than, for instance, my wife, who is also a pastor in the same denomination, or than a colleague of mine who happens to be both female and a person of color in my denomination. And I have had people say to me, well, I, no offense, I know you're married to one, but I prefer a male pastor to a female pastor. And I'm like, oh, really? And because I'm me and because oppositional defiance is a thing, that was the moment at which I decided anytime I was away on vacation or continuing ed, my substitute was going to be female. So when I needed to find a sub to fill in for me when I was gone, I immediately skipped all of the men on the sub list and started calling my female colleagues to come and be subs and give them the added income, and also, hey, you need to get used to seeing women in leadership.
Yeah. So there's actually a word for when an identity feels more forward in a space. There's, well, a phrase. It's called identity salience. So if we go back to that idea of like identities as ingredients in a cake, something that's more salient, say, might be if you are making a cake and it has chocolate chips in it, and you can feel those chocolate chips because they're more forward, right?
Right.
As an as an ingredient, it's more salient, more forward, more aware of. So for me, when I walk into a faith space, I'm more aware of my romantic and gender identities and expression.
Mm-hmm. And
Um, but
if I can clarify, and I'm going to advance a supposition here, and you tell me if I'm accurate or not. I think I am. Otherwise, I wouldn't advance it, obviously. But my supposition is that the fact that your romantic orientation, your gender identity, your gender presentation, those things are more salient for you when you walk into a faith space is not because you're feeling particularly romantic when you walk into a faith space. It's because it is a faith space and some of the things that are part of your experience with faith spaces. Um,
yes,
and and I think that's really important. The reason I bring that up and bring that out explicitly is I think it's really important for cis het people of faith to hear and understand that a lot of our LGBTQIA plus siblings have had experiences in faith centered spaces that make those parts of their identity become salient. Not because, you know, for instance, their romantic orientation, not because they're coming to church viewing it as, a dating scene or someplace where they might find a soulmate, but because their experience with churches has been one of being told that their romantic orientation is problematic, sinful, bad, evil, whatever. And the reason I'm banging this drum so hard right now and making a big deal of this is because for people who are watching or listening to this podcast who are cishet people and are cishet people of faith, this is something a lot of cishet people of faith don't understand about the experience of a lot of LGBTQIA plus people with faith communities and faith-based spaces.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And you would be on point there that it's not because I'm looking for a date, it's because I'm fully aware that there may be people who believe I don't belong in the room.
Right.
And that goes back to both the idea of intersectionality as all the different parts of me that I can't separate out, and to the idea of intersecting systems of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think this is a good transition point to the next quote I have. And I may or may not, aka I did, base my entire dissertation on a particular quote by Pat Parker. Pat Parker was a Black lesbian poet and activist, and in her 1999 piece, Movement in Black, she wrote, "If I could take all of my parts with me when I go somewhere, not have to say to one of them, no, you stay home tonight, you won't be welcome, because I'm going to an all-white party where I can be gay but not Black, or I'm going to a Black poetry reading and half the poets are anti-homosexual, or thousands of situations where something of what I am cannot come with me. The day all the different parts of me can come along, we would have what I would call a revolution." So your immediate response is, wow. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, my immediate response is wow. My second response is that'll preach, because I think it's true for a lot of people that we feel like in different spaces we have to um, hide or mask different parts of who we are, right? Like I remember I was sitting in an AA meeting once, and in like street clothes like this, and it was my turn to share, and I was talking, and I said something about being a member of the clergy, and that at that point in time, I was less anxious about telling a group of strangers that I was an alcoholic than I was about telling a group of strangers that I was a member of the clergy. And somebody in the room, some smart aleck, said under their breath, but loud enough for everybody to hear, and rightly so. You know, so there are spaces where I don't feel comfortable letting people know that I'm a member of the clergy. There are spaces where I don't feel comfortable letting people know that I'm a recovering alcoholic. And there are a lot of spaces where there are parts of my sense of humor or parts of my personality that I feel like I have to mask or cut off or shut down. And not because they're inappropriate for that space necessarily, as much as because somebody in that space won't be okay with it. And
Yeah.
I think pretty much every human being I know has that experience at some point. At least a lot of human beings have told me they've had that experience. So yeah, I think that quote from Pat Parker is itself revolutionary.
Yes. Um, Hence a dissertation based off the topic about bringing our full selves into the room. But also, you are aware you just told the entire interwebs you're an alcoholic.
At this point, I don't. At this point, I'm not worried about it. I'm not fussed about who knows. Like my whole congregation knows. I mean, I've got it tattooed on my arm for crying out loud. I'm
Yeah,
not worried about that. But you know,
it's
in
my
certain,
sarcasm that had to point it out.
yeah, in certain settings, I am. I'm more worried about having told the whole interwebs that I'm a pastor,
Fair. Very
because
fair.
because there are some. some prejudices out there around that, most of which have some basis in fact, right? There's a lot of people who've been very badly hurt by the church and will therefore assume that I'm one of those people.
Um, yeah, it's so for me, I fell in love with this quote. I heard it in like 2012, and it just stuck with me for years. This idea of being able to take all the different parts of me into a room and I learned from Black feminists and Black feminisms that I should be able to bring all the different parts of me along. And that has drastically informed who I am as an academic. It has drastically informed why this podcast is a thing, because I love teaching, but some days my neurodivergence doesn't make that as a possibility. Things that we maybe should admit to the entire internet. But when I fell in love with this quote, I hadn't had an officially traumatic brain injury yet. And by the time that I realized, I by the time that I realized that I got knocked from like actually reading at a PhD level to reading at a third grade level in the middle of my PhD, I wasn't going back. I just had to find a way to get to go along, right? To bring my full self into the room. And fortunately, I had a dissertation committee who was willing to work with me on that. They worked with me on accommodations for my exams and my presentations. They really just worked with me. And part of all of this was I decided to start writing how I think, which isn't in a line. It is not linear. Nothing about me is straight. But it's recognizing that I can't leave my disabilities at home and I can't leave my queerness at home. I am multiply queer, multiply disabled, and I am also an activist and an educator, an artist. And I bring all of these different parts with me when I go somewhere. Whether or not I share them is the different story. And part of the Affirming Practice podcast is making it so people can bring their full selves into the room and not have to hide who they are. At least that's part of what it is for me.
And I will also say that in my experience as you know, since we're in a mode of self-revelation here, as somebody who is a person in recovery and who is an abuse survivor and who is a person who lives with both neurodivergence and CPTSD, and just as a person with kind of an offbeat sense of humor sometimes and an odd personality and all of those things, those spaces where I feel like I am free to bring my full self into the room and be fully myself, the I have a word for those. I call those home. You know, what
Um,
whether they are my home, like literally my house where I live with my wife or not, those spaces where I can be most unreservedly myself and most unapologetically myself are the places that feel most like home to me.
yeah,
Um, and I say most unreservedly because like we all have armor that we wear. We all have those walls that we put up, I think, in self-defense. And for those of us who are survivors, like it can be really hard to let those down even a little bit. But having places where it is safe to do so, yeah, those are the places that I would describe as home.
definitely. That was a very powerful way to phrase that. And I think I'd have to agree with you. It's, and it's not just the spaces, it's the who. Like being able to bring my full self into the room like you said, it's not just my house, it's who I'm with. It's not where I live, it's who I'm with. It's, I don't have to hide in front of my dog, but I also don't have to hide in front of my dear friends and my chosen family.
Mhm.
Um, and sometimes I still do hide because, like you said, we all have that armor. We have things that we don't share with the world or don't share with people en masse. But for me, home is the people with whom I can bring my full self. And while I believe everyone should be able to bring their full selves into the space, even people I disagree with their politics, for example, I teach and I've had people who in my classes who actively disagree with what I am teaching. And my thing is, I will teach you what I can, and you can choose to receive that or not. I'm not going to punish you for like believing differently than I am, but I expect you to do the work. And this is like one of those practical applications, right? So on the Affirming Practice podcast, something that we talk about is the practical applications. What does intersectionality look like? For example, in creating affirming spaces and creating spaces in which people can bring all the different parts of them along and can experience what Pat Parker would call a revolution. Um, and so we've already started talking about why this matters in creating affirming spaces. Um, and I want to drive some points home and feel free to interrupt me. But so we have to think intersectionally for to create spaces in which all the different parts of people can come along. Affirming someone's queerness but not their race isn't affirming. Affirming someone's gender but not their socioeconomic class, so how rich or poor they are, is not affirming. But affirming someone's gender and sexual orientation or class or faith or whatever the intersection is, and there's always going to be multiple because we are always all multiple things at once. Recognizing those intersections and affirming them doesn't have to mean agreeing with them, though who someone is isn't something you really get to disagree with.
Mhm.
But it does mean treating someone and seeing those things. We talked about it in the last episode, episode 5, about the invisible isms. And I don't see gender, I just see KCN. Well, if you don't see gender, then you can't see me. But they're standalone episodes, but they build on one another. There is some logic to my madness.
That makes one of us.
Um, I appreciate you. But we look at intersectionality as Crenshaw puts it. We also look at intersectionality in the phrasing of who we are as individuals and in the idea of revolution that Pat Parker provides. Is there anything you want to add before we put it into practice?
I think just to sort of put some meat on the bones, so to speak, of the, affirming somebody's queerness, but not their race is not affirming or what have you. Yeah, it's not affirming if you're saying, well, I I I have no problem with this person being LGBTQIA plus, but man, I really can't stand being around black queer people or whatever, right? Or if if you claim that you have done the work of anti-racism and what have you, but you really only have positive views of people of color who happen to also be middle class or above on the socioeconomic scale, like that's problematic, and
Yeah.
to recognize, again, it comes back to there are layers of privilege, there are layers of oppression, there are layers of identity, and you know, affirming a portion of somebody's identity and not another portion of it is a way of distancing ourselves from their full humanity. You know, I don't have to like somebody's gender expression to recognize that they are fully human and entitled to express their gender how they choose. It might not be the way that I would do it, and that's okay, because it ain't my gender that's being expressed.
I, one, had to write down that bit about distancing ourselves from parts of who someone is distancing ourselves from their full humanity. That's wonderful, but also idea for another episode. We might want to talk about power, privilege, and oppression. Might be helpful. We're
Yeah,
talking about it already, but very explicit, like doing so
focusing
explicitly.
on that for an episode. Right. And,
Yeah.
you know, like I say, I wake up every day very aware of the fact that, I have about 8 layers of privilege operating before I even get out of bed in the morning. And that just means that there are certain things that I'm not going to have to deal with in a given day that other people do.
Yeah.
Um, and life is hard enough, like without having all those other things. And so, like, I can go one of two ways with that. One way I can go with that is to say, well, see, my life is hard too. Everybody's life is hard. Or I can step back and have some empathy and say, damn, if my life can be challenging as a cishet white male American Christian who happens to not be disabled, etc., imagine how much more difficult it is for my friends who don't have all of those layers of privilege, who have to deal with shit that I don't even have to think about if I don't want to.
Yeah. And to be clear, no hierarchies of oppression,
Right.
but the layers of oppression which we face create drastic differences in our lived experiences.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
And those can vary from time to time and place to place. It can be much more difficult to be, for instance, a person of color in one school system than in another school system. Even in very sort of parallel environments, there are environmental factors within each individual one that can make the experience of oppression or not greater or less in those different places.
Because intersectionality.
Right.
In gender studies classes, you get because intersectionality a lot, at least in mine when I'm teaching. Okay. Today's Put It Into Practice is asking you to consider making your environment more intersectionally prepared in order to support more people at the whole person level. Please share in video or in the comments what thinking about your practices in an intersectionally affirming way means to you. What does it look like for you to add or to deepen the intersectional lenses through which you work? As always, you can also click the link in the bio to submit a question and as anonymously as you would like to for us to talk about on the podcast. There's kind of a story that I want to tell before before we close out here. And that's I am a non-binary lesbian. When I met my now ex-husband, um, one before either of us recognized trans was a possibility. But I had to ask myself if I could be a lesbian and be in love with or married to a trans guy. And did calling myself a lesbian like seem like I was invalidating who he was?
Mm.
And could I be non-binary and a lesbian? Which is actually a question that I've been asked to broach on the podcast is how can someone be a non-binary lesbian? It's weird, right? It sounds weird, that intersection of gender and sexual or romantic orientation, because I follow a split model of attraction, which means that sexual orientation and romantic orientation are different things. Um, but for me, I'm actually a non-binary woman, which sounds absurd as well in how people understand binary and how they understand gender. But for me, to be non-binary is to say that I experience my gender, to quote Andrea Gibson or paraphrase Andrea Gibson, who was a non-binary poet, as like it's best to explain my gender as between here and there, between male and female, like that journey in between is how I explain my gender. And to be a lesbian just says a lot about who I'm attracted to, romantically and sexually. Um, and the intersections are messy and it's hard to explain. And it took a long time for me to recognize that who I am and how I phrase who I am does not have to change because of who I'm in a relationship with. And that's a conversation for me to have with my partner about what it means for them. If I'm saying I'm a non binary lesbian and they're a trans guy, what does that mean? And to have that conversation honestly, because every person is going to understand that differently and experience that differently. And it took a long time for me to come back to where I felt I could claim non binary and woman and lesbian at the same time, because for so many people, they're contradictory. But for me, they fit together.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much sense that made.
Actually, that makes perfect sense to me. And part of what I was thinking as you were describing this, even before you said, this is a conversation to have with your partner, I think this is part of what it says to me is people get to choose their own self descriptors. And like, I don't have to understand how non-binary lesbian works, right? Like that's not something that I have to like decipher.
Yeah.
What I know is my friend Casey Ann describes themselves as a non-binary lesbian. Good enough for me.
Yeah.
And that's how I don't know how it would ever come up for me to describe those parts about you. If I needed to, though, for some reason, that's how I would describe you because that's how you choose to be described. That's how you choose to describe yourself. And I don't have to get it to respect it and to honor it and to what's the word I'm looking for?
Affirm.
Affirm that, not even affirm it is like I'm trying to get at the idea of that's how you describe yourself. That's good enough for me. I don't have to understand it to simply say, this is how they prefer to be described. That's all
Yeah.
that matters. Right. And I was thinking about this. I've obviously been thinking about these topics a lot lately since we started doing the podcast, and particularly with it being Pride Month and some of the other things that are going on in the world. And was thinking back to an acquaintance of mine who described themselves as gender fluid and was probably the first person I ever knew personally who self described as gender fluid. And because we were in an appropriate place for me to be able to ask this, I could say, can you help me understand what that means? And they said, well, here's what it means for me. And I can tell you, I at one point spent a lot of time daily around this person, never saw them adopting any gender expression other than what we would typically call mask presenting. Doesn't change the fact that they are gender fluid, because like they don't owe me a variable presentation to claim fluidity. They don't owe me androgyny to claim gender fluidity, or non-binary people don't owe me androgyny. Like, if someone chooses that description, like, they know them better than I will ever know them, right? Who the hell am I
Well,
to say you can't be, right? And that's kind of how I think about things like non-binary lesbian. Like, I don't know what it's like to walk in around inside your head or inside your skin.
be glad.
Likewise, but I don't need to get it. Like, I don't need to have it all ironed out and whatever. What I know is that's how you describe yourself, and I can respect that.
Yeah. And while I feel like we might also have to do something just about like labels, I want to share something. It was a beautiful piece of wisdom that a high schooler taught me in like 2013, 2014 maybe. And that is, labels give us something to Google. They're point of reference, a way for me to articulate something about myself that gives you a way to understand who I am, or understand me in relation to others. So if I say I am a lesbian, and I do, that's something you can Google, what is a lesbian, and that's going to come up. Or you can Google what is non-binary lesbian. That's going to come up. For folks out there Googling, I highly recommend, rather, for folks out there who might tell someone to Google, recommend looking up the thing before you tell someone to Google, just in case. Um,
And also, safe search is a thing. Like, you can set your settings on Google so that when you Google one of these terms, you get like
appropriate hits,
educational you get educational hits instead of Pornhub.
not safe for work.
Right.
Yeah. But the idea that labels give us something to,
You froze. I have never seen this happen on Zoom before.